My name is TABEA SQUIRE and my piece is called Owl. There have been various alternate pronunciations of it today at the rehearsals, but it's definitely Owl. Owl is a word that means many things. It can mean bright, it can mean shining, and it can be the long white cloud in the name Aotearoa. Now it just so happens if you go to figure E of my piece, you would find those words actually transcribed in a massive tutti in the orchestra. So there are quite a few elements in this piece. The original idea was that I wanted to write a piece that was basically a New Zealand piece, and it was difficult to decide where to start with how to write a New Zealand piece. And I thought about the name Aotearoa, and I looked into translations of it, and there are actually a whole lot of possible translations of the name Aotearoa. It could be not just the land of the long white cloud, but the land of shining brightness, the land of mists, I think the land of rainbows, or even just the shining land. And that's a fascinating thing about this prefix, is that if you look at translations of it, depending on the context, they can mean all of these very diverse, but in some of them very similar things. And one of the things I notice about being in New Zealand as compared to other places, and I'm not the only person who's noticed this, is that the sun here does seem to be somehow more vivid or sharp than in other places, that it's noticeably gentler, maybe because we have less ozone in the ozone layer or something. And what I notice is the strange consequence of that is not that the light is brighter, but when you are near the middle of the day, the shadows appear darker. And I've noticed this before in the way I perceive midday light in New Zealand, is almost that it's darker than it is at the times when light seems to suffuse the air in dawns and dusks. The idea of the transcribed speech was something I really wanted to try, in that you have a whole lot of instruments in a similar register saying the same thing in similar outlines, but slightly out of synchronization in rhythm. And in the piece that starts in the double basses after the opening percussion solo. So that's one of the motifs of the piece, is this transcribed massed speech, which, as I was thinking about it, could also, if you listen to it in another way, be a kind of a transcription of the appearance of complex shadows or light, and the way that it can become overwhelming when there are sources and reflections and shadows. There are also actual sounds of New Zealand in terms of music, in that one of the main motifs is an imitation of the conch, and pretty much everyone gets that. I've shown it basically in the approximate outline of a fifth, but you also get quarter sharps and things in there. And then there's also all this light and shadow. And with the light and shadow, I wanted to play with saturation as well, so to fill in an area of register with notes. But I didn't want to do that chromatically, because then you just end up with walls and you can't do much with them. So Owl is the first orchestral piece in which I really tried to use a technique or a kind of note generation, which for the sake of brevity I call NORIs. Stands for non-octave repeating interval sets, but appropriately enough I came up with the idea when I was studying post-tonal theory under Michael Norris. So to basically try to explain it is that, yeah, it's sort of like having key signatures, but they don't have a tonic. So you have a certain set of intervals, and those intervals keep repeating, but because they don't repeat within the octave, you end up with a whole wall of notes that you can choose from. Now, I've used them more or less in pieces before, but in this one it's definitely more than less, in that it's the basis from which most of the material, if it's not actually chromatic, is being derived from. And there are mirrors in how I'm using these sets of nories as well. I have one sequence here, and then later on I reverse the sequence. So it's been interesting to see if that comes across at all. And also just to explore how clusters come across when they're very large, depending on the kinds of intervals they have. And it's fascinating that it's not just the intervals within the cluster that make it sound interesting, but at which point the intervals repeat. So if you have something that repeats at the major seventh, the cluster will actually sound more harsh, even if it has fewer semitones, than if it repeats at the fifth. So I've been learning all sorts of things like that.